Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Today we journey into the rise and fall of Venice, a city born from marshes yet destined to rule the seas. This is the story of how a fragile lagoon settlement forged an empire of trade, defied kings and empires, and left behind a legacy as dazzling as it was unlikely. The Roman Empire was collapsing. Armies that once marched in triumph now limped home in defeat. In the year 452, Attila and his Huns swept into northern Italy, leaving ash and terror in their wake. Cities burned, farmland withered, and even Rome itself trembled at the thought of falling. But in the shadow of this apocalypse, something unexpected happened. On the edge of the Adriatic, desperate refugees fled into the marshes, staking their lives on a land that seemed uninhabitable. Here in shallow lagoons where the sea swallowed the earth, they found safety not in walls of stone, but in a fortress of water. This was not the birth of a city, it was the birth of survival. And from survival, Venice would rise. Life in the lagoons was brutal. The soil was too poor to farm, the air thick with salt, the tides unpredictable. Yet the refugees endured. They learned to draw their wealth not from the land, but from the water. Fishing nets replaced plows. Salt pans shimmered under the sun, turning hardship into profit. Small islands became dotted with huts and workshops, each family carving out an existence against the sea. But survival alone was not enough. With every raid from Hun's Goths and later the Lombards, the scattered lagoon dwellers realized a truth alone: they would be swallowed. Together, they could endure. And so these fishermen and salt miners began to act as one people, united not by castles or kings, but by necessity. What started as refuge was slowly transforming into something greater, a society bound by water, by danger, and by the will to survive. 3 centuries passed. The marshland communities had grown into a network of settlements bound not by kings, but by fragile alliances. Yet danger was never far away. Raiders still prowled Italy, and without leadership, Venice risked vanishing back into the sea. So the Venetians gathered and chose a leader Orso I Pato remembered as their first doge. His election marked more than just a figurehead, it was the beginning of a tradition unlike most of medieval Europe. To survive, Venice turned toward the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. Aligning with the emperor in Constantinople offered protection and prestige, and it tethered this small lagoon settlement to one of the greatest powers of the age. Venice was still fragile, still surrounded by stronger kingdoms. But with leadership and an imperial ally, it was no longer a nameless cluster of fishermen's huts. It was becoming a city with ambition. The fall of the Lombards left a dangerous vacuum. In the north, the Franks led by Charlemagne were rising as the new masters of Europe. To the east, Byzantium still watched over its fading empire. Venice stood between them, caught in the crossfire of giants. Some Venetians whispered that safety lay with the Franks. Others clung to their Byzantine ties. But before any choice could be made, war arrived. Charlemagne's son, Pepin of Italy, marched his army toward the lagoons. He saw Venice as little more than a marshy prize ripe for conquest. For the first time, the Venetians faced the test of defending not just their homes, but the very idea of their city. Pepin's army advanced with confidence. They were Frank seasoned warriors who had crushed kingdoms across Europe. What could a cluster of fishermen do against them? But Venice was no ordinary city. It was a fortress of water. The Rialto Islands became the heart of resistance. The Venetians used every channel, every sandbank, every hidden tide to their advantage. Frankish cavalry sank into the mud. Siege engines collapsed in the brine. Soldiers who pressed too far into the lagoon never returned. And then came disease. Pepin's men trapped in the swamps began to wither as the Venetians endured. No walls were breached, no city fell. The Franks had no choice but to withdraw. From that day, the Rialto was no longer just a refuge. It was a citadel, the seat of Venice, a city that had proven it could not be taken by force. In the aftermath of Pepin's failed invasion, Venice stood taller than ever. A year later, Doge Agnello Partiziaco declared the construction of a new capital on the Rialto, solidifying the islands as the beating heart of the Republic. But survival alone was not enough. Venice needed recognition. And in the year 814, an agreement between the Franks and Byzantines did something extraordinary. It formally acknowledged Venice's independence. No longer a pawn between empires, the lagoon people had carved out their own place on the map. A fragile, glittering city had been born neither Frankish nor Byzantine, but proudly Venetian. Independence gave Venice more than freedom. It gave her an identity, one that would only grow sharper in the centuries ahead. By the 11th century, Venice was no longer a desperate refuge. It had become a city with a soul of its own. While kings and dukes ruled elsewhere, Venice stood apart, a republic in a feudal world. But make no mistake, this was no democracy of the people. Elections were restored, yet only the noble families of Rialto could truly vote. Still, these limits had an unexpected effect. They prevented any one dynasty from seizing absolute power. The Doge wore the crown of Venice, but he did not rule unchecked. He was bound by councils of merchants and nobles who guarded the republic's independence as fiercely as its lagoon walls. It was this system, exclusive, imperfect, yet remarkably stable, that allowed Venice to endure when so many medieval states crumbled. And it gave the Venetians something more valuable than titles or crowns, a sense of identity distinct and unshakable. Venice's fortune was tied to the sea, but also to the empire across it. Byzantium, the Eastern Roman remnant, needed strong allies to defend its naval borders. Venice stepped forward. Venetian galleys reinforced Byzantine fleets, patrolled Sicilian waters, and kept the Mediterranean trade lanes open. In return, Constantinople opened its gates. Venetian merchants were exempt from customs dues, granted their own quarter within the city, and given the right to trade freely. Grain, wine, salt, and timber flowed out of Venice. Silks, spices, and treasures from the Near East came back in. The lagoon city, once a haven for refugees, was turning into Europe's golden marketplace. Every ship that sailed home carried not just goods, but proof Venice was no longer a backwater. It was a rising power, and the world was beginning to notice. Among all the treasures that passed through Venice, one commodity mattered above all others: spices. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, luxuries from the East that could transform food, preserve meat, and flaunt wealth. Venetian merchants became the gatekeepers of these exotic goods. Their fleets brought salt from the lagoons, timber from Dalmatia, and slaves from the Balkans, and exchanged them in Constantinople for silks and spices. The profits were staggering. But wealth can change a people. The humble lagoon settlers became sharp dealers, masters of trade, and soon arrogant rivals. Their confidence swelled as their coffers filled, and tensions with Byzantium began to smolder. Venice had tasted power, and it hungered for more. The year was 1204. The Crusaders had set out to reclaim the Holy Land. But under the guidance of Venice and its nearly blind 96-year-old Doge, Enrico Dandolo, the course of history shifted. Instead of Jerusalem, the Crusaders turned their swords on Constantinople. The greatest Christian city in the East was looted and burned, not by its Muslim enemies, but by fellow Christians. Venice reaped the rewards. They seized relics, gold, and priceless treasures, some of which still glitter in St. Mark's Basilica today. They took entire cities, ports, and coastlines, carving a Venetian empire across the Aegean. But with every jewel and relic they carried home, Venice also carried something darker: the enmity of Byzantium. The sack of Constantinople marked not just a triumph, but a betrayal that would never be forgotten. By the 13th century, Venice stood unrivaled. Genoa and Pisa, once fierce competitors, now trailed behind as Venetian galleys commanded the seas. The Republic had transformed itself into the beating heart of Mediterranean commerce. The spice trade made Venice rich beyond imagining. Their fleets carried Eastern luxuries into Europe, and their deal with the Mamluks of Egypt ensured a steady flow of goods even after the Crusades had failed. Wherever merchants gathered from Alexandria to Bruges, Venetian silver and silk followed. It was more than trade. Venice's empire stretched across islands and ports, each one a jewel that secured their dominance at sea. The lagoon city was no longer merely a refuge of fishermen. It was the capital of a maritime empire feared and admired across the known world. But empires do not rise alone. In 1453, Constantinople, Venice's old partner and rival, fell to a new power, the Ottoman Empire. The city once called the Queen of Cities was now Istanbul, and the balance of the world had shifted. At first, Venice adapted. The Ottomans granted them trading rights, and Venetian merchants once again flooded into the east. The Republic profited from the very empire that had destroyed Byzantium. But the partnership was uneasy. The Ottomans were not content to be partners forever. As their power expanded, they began to choke off Venetian access to the Black Sea and to the vital markets of Egypt. For the first time in centuries, Venice felt its grip on the spice trade slipping. The shadow of a new empire was falling across its golden age. The blow came swiftly. In 1517, Sultan Selim I conquered Egypt. With it, he seized Alexandria, the very artery through which Venice's spice wealth had flowed for centuries. New restrictions were imposed. Venetian ships were cut off from the Red Sea, their access to the Black Sea blocked. Cargoes of pepper and cinnamon that once filled Venetian warehouses dwindled. Prices soared, profits collapsed. For a city that had built its empire on spices, it was nothing less than a slow strangulation. The lagoon that had once smelled of salt and the sea now reeked of decline. And as Venice faltered, the world beyond the Mediterranean was changing. A new ocean frontier was opening, one that Venice was never meant to rule. Just as the spice routes slipped from Venice's grasp, a new world opened. In 1492, Spain's triumph over Granada flung open the gates of the Atlantic. Beyond it lay oceans Venice had never sailed, and riches it could no longer control. Yet the Republic did not collapse. Instead, it turned westward. Venetian merchants forged ties with the principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, trading with Flanders and the markets of Germany. From them came metals and crafts that Venice spread across the Mediterranean. It was not the golden river of the spice trade, but it kept the lagoon alive. Once again, Venice proved what had defined it from the beginning, the ability to adapt when survival demanded it. But the tides of history were shifting fast, and this time, the lagoon city was swimming against the current. By the 16th century, Venice glittered at its height. Its canals bustled with merchants from every corner of Europe. Its navy patrolled the seas, unmatched in discipline and might. Its population swelled, its palaces gleamed, and its wealth per person was the envy of Christendom. The city was more than a marketplace, it was a stage. Diplomats, artists, and princes all flocked to Venice, dazzled by its splendor. From the arsenal's shipyards to the glassmakers of Murano, the Republic radiated confidence. For a moment it seemed eternal. A city born from mudflats had risen to command an empire of trade. Venice was at the very peak of its story. Yet history has no patience for permanence. Even at its zenith, new rivals were stirring beyond the horizon. The 17th century brought storms Venice could not master. Beyond the Atlantic, new empires were rising. The Dutch Republic, fueled by New World silver and Asian spices, built fleets larger and faster than Venice's proud galleys. Soon after the English joined the race, their sails stretching across oceans Venice had never dared to cross. The Mediterranean, once the heart of global trade, was becoming a side street. The center of wealth and power had shifted to the Atlantic. Venice, once the gatekeeper of the East, now found itself outpaced, its monopoly shattered. It was still rich, still proud, but no longer unrivaled. The city of lagoons had reigned for centuries, but history was handing the crown to others. Even as rivals rose, Venice clung to something rare in a feudal world, a republic of merchants. While Europe bowed to kings and dynasties, the Doge of Venice ruled under constant watch. Councils of nobles checked his every move, ensuring no man could make the city his personal kingdom. It was not freedom for all, only the wealthiest families held real power. Yet this system gave Venice a stability few monarchies could match. Dynasties crumbled, thrones toppled, but Venice endured, guided not by crowns but by contracts. This republican spirit became the city's true strength. It shaped Venice into a state built on trade negotiation and balance, a place where the sea-knot bloodlines determined destiny. If trade was Venice's lifeblood, the arsenal was its beating heart. Built in 1104, this colossal shipyard became the engine of the Republic's power. Here, thousands of workers labored with near-industrial precision, launching war galleys at a pace no rival could match. Some say an entire warship could be assembled in a single day. But Venice's brilliance went beyond ships. Murano's glassmakers created treasures so coveted that their secrets were guarded like state intelligence. Silk weavers, mosaicists, and wood carvers spread Venetian artistry across Europe, turning the city into a workshop of wonders. Even in finance, Venice innovated. Government bonds and tax-free securities gave merchants tools that shaped the future of banking. The arsenal, the markets, the crafts together, they made Venice more than a city. They made it a machine of empire. From a scattering of huts in the marshes, Venice had become a titan of the seas. Its ships stitched together the Mediterranean. Its merchants carried silk, spices, glass, and gold to every corner of Europe. Its art and architecture rivaled the greatest courts of the Renaissance. But the Venetians never forgot their origins. They saw themselves as heirs of ancient Rome, a republic reborn on the water. Unlike Rome, they conquered not through legions but through trade diplomacy and the strength of their fleet. For centuries, Venice stood as proof that a city need not have fertile fields or endless armies to command the world. Its legacy was not just wealth or power, but the audacity to build an empire where no empire should have stood. Venice was born from desperation, a city of exiles hiding in the water, clinging to survival. Yet from that fragile beginning, it forged centuries of wealth, influence, and glory. But history is merciless. The same tides that once protected Venice eventually left it stranded as the world's trade shifted elsewhere. What was once the beating heart of commerce became a beautiful relic of a vanished age. And yet the story of Venice lingers a reminder that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely of places. If a city raised on stilts above a swamp could command the Mediterranean, what else might determination, unity, and vision achieve? Perhaps that is the true legacy of Venice, not its fall, but the astonishing fact that it ever rose at all.